Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
Sharpen up your knives and appetites. We're doing veal for a king today on the French Chef. Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we are doing a boned leg of veal stuffed and braised in herbs and wine. It's a perfectly delicious dish. And veal needs some kind of an excitement, like herbs and wine and braising and stuffing, because the meat doesn't have very much character in itself, but when you cook it the way we do today, it really is a dish fit for a king. And what we have is, I've got two pieces of veal to show you. This one is the leg, and this is what you usually see for a roast of veal, the whole leg. This part down here is where the hoof was, and there's his shank, and up here there's the knee, and then the rump, and then the back goes off in there. And here is your cross cut of it, showing the meat and part of your leg bone. And what veal is adolescent calf, and veal is aged from 5 to 12 weeks, and then as it gets a little bit older, it gradually turns into a beef. And the cuts of veal look just like the cuts of beef. Of course, they're much smaller, and I think you'll be able to see a little bit better on this blow-up in which the pieces are separated. You have here the leg bone, and then this is part of the meat which would correspond to the beef knuckle, and then there's what would correspond to the beef bottom round and the eye of the round, and there is the top round. And in France, when you buy veal, you can get it so that it really is about 10 weeks old and is completely milk-fed, and it has very pale pink flesh, which looks just about like the color of raw, dark chicken meat. And if you can get these very large pieces of veal if you order them specially, and I've got one piece here to show you. This corresponds to that bottom round of the veal. And this would be ideal for this recipe if you could possibly get it. I ordered this from my butcher, and it took him about 10 days to find a piece of this size and quality. But I thought you'd like to see it because it can be gotten if you order it. But I'm going to use the kind of veal that you would be able to see usually in your market, because I don't want you to think, oh, well, she gets all this fancy stuff, so I couldn't do that recipe. But in this, because we're going to stuff it, we want to bone it. And if you're going to bone anything, this leg is very easy to bone indeed. You have to have sharp knives. And this is a little knife that I got at a butcher's supply store. If you look up in the yellow pages of your telephone book, you can find out where to get butcher's supply things. This is a sharp little carbon steel knife. And this sharpening steel I got for $1.95 at my hardware store. And you want to get a knife that you can very easily sharpen. And when you sharpen it, you put it on your steel and then raise it just a little bit and then scrape it up and down on one side, and then scrape it up and down on the other side, and then give it a few whips like that. And then it's really sharp when you feel it with your finger, and you can feel how sharp it is. Or if you put it, just rub it across the skin of a tomato, it will cut the tomato. And you can get good knives if you insist upon them, and if you're going to do any kind of cooking, you just have to have good, sharp knives. And so I'm going to start boning this veal. You can, of course, have your butcher do it, but sometimes they're too busy or they don't want to, so that you might just as well know how to do it yourself. So here is our leg again. There's the hoof part, and here is the rump part. And the bone comes right down there. You can just hear it by banging it with your knife. And so all you want to do is to separate the flesh from the bone and keep the flesh as intact as possible, and get a nice little knife, and just where the bone hits the flesh, you just start cutting right down. I don't pretend to be a professional boner, but something like this is so easy to do. You just expose the meat and then just keep scraping right down the bone. You'll be amazed to see how big a bone this is going to be. So now this piece is almost 5 pounds, and I got it at my supermarket, and it cost $4.02. And you're going to see that about half of it is bone. And that other piece of veal, that beautiful, great big one that you saw, doesn't have any bone in it at all, and it costs twice as much, but then there's no waste in it at all. You see, when you're boning, you just scrape your meat away from the bone, not cutting the flesh. This one, very often they break the shank like that. I guess they do that so that you can put it into your pan easily. I think I'd better put on my glasses now that I'm getting down into a little more complicated part of it. But all the meat on this is just on the other side of that bone. So when I get the bone out of here, all the rest of it's just going to be meat. It's just a matter of, just as you can see, just scraping around. So there isn't much of a trick to it. I think in some supermarkets they charge you for boning, and I don't see any reason for paying for boning when you can do it so easily. If you just have a knife that'll cut things, and then you can use your bone for soup. So don't ever throw a bone away. Now that's almost apart. Now this big white thing, that's what's called a ball joint. That's the knee joint. Then there's a little white thing here, which is sort of part of the knee cap, I guess. That's the kind of thing you can hurt when you go skiing. Now we just have the shank left, and be sure that you bone it where the bone is right against the meat. I'm sorry this shank was cut this way, but I thought it best to do something that you would ordinarily see. If you ordered this probably in a supermarket, you could order it without having the shank cut. It's just going to make it a little bit more difficult to stuff, but I wanted to stuff the most difficult piece so that you would see the worst possible circumstances. And now there's our meat. It certainly doesn't look like much of anything at all sprawled out that way. But as you see, we're going to be able to stuff it. And then we have these 2 great big bones. I think that probably weighs about 1/3 as much as the whole piece of meat that we have. And these 2 little bones here you can save and use for stock. And these are rather difficult to whack up. I've tried whacking up one of these things, but I broke a knife. And if you have somebody in the house with a good saw, you could saw the bone apart, which would work out very nicely. So I'm going to save these 2 to use for my stock, and then this we will use for the stuffing. And then this is going to be slit along, and then the stuffing is going to go in here. As you can see, if you had this lovely big piece of meat here, you would have no trouble at all. And if you have a butcher who is cooperative and you're in an area where that you can get these great big pieces of veal, do order one of these, because if you're going to do this kind of a recipe, it makes a perfectly beautiful roast. And whether or not you're going to stuff it, you could, you see, tie it up this way, and then when you roasted it, you would have beautiful, even, thick slices. And this is also the part, either the top or the bottom part of the round, that you would use in France as for scallops of veal. Because in France, the veal scallops are cut about well, about 3/8 of an inch thick, and then they're pounded down a little bit, but they aren't as thin as the Italian scallops. But you can see, if you can get a piece like this, you'll have a much more beautiful scallop, and you also, when you have your roast, you have much more beautiful slices. I'll bring this back every now and then so that you can see how lovely it is. And now I'm going to slit this. So then that's where the stuffing will go in. But it isn't going to make any difference that the meat looks a little bit messy now because it's going to be tied up. And this should be slit in about 3/4 of an inch slices, and then you don't slit all the way down. So if you have your butcher bone the meat for you, tell him not to tie it because you're going to have to untie it and slit it anyway. And I'm leaving the bottom of the meat attached. There, so that's all ready. And we're going to marinate the meat. Now this is, you don't have to marinate the meat if you don't want to, because this is a regal recipe. I'm going to do the whole hog, so to speak. So put your meat in a bowl, and then have some parsley sprigs, and tie them together with string, and then have a little herb packet. I've got a ½ teaspoon of thyme and a bay leaf, and about 6 peppercorns in here. And then we're going to have some marinade vegetables, and we're going to have 2 onions and 2 carrots. And with the carrots, you would peel them first, and then slice them up in very thin rounds. These little, I think everyone's familiar with these little vegetable peelers, but they're certainly wonderful with their rotating blade. They make peeling so much more easy. And then cut that one end off, and then cut your carrot in half if it's a long one, and then cut one piece off the long side, so that the carrot will lie flat. And then, with your thumb used as a pusher, and holding your knife this way, you see in your thumb and finger, you want to come straight down, see, just like that. As you can see that when you practice this movement, slicing becomes very easy to do. And then when those are sliced, they go in to your bowl. But if you practice on slicing and chopping, which is really the dog work of cooking, you'll find these things go so fast, and they should, because you shouldn't spend any more time than necessary over just the plain sort of rudimentary things like this. Now your onion, that of course gets peeled too, cutting off the 2 ends and then just pulling the skin right down. And that's going to be chopped in very much the same way, but in this case you cut your onion in half. Then we want it to fall in slices, so you cut off the 2 ends here and here, just to get it started that way, and then you hold your onion horizontally, and then do exactly the same system. See, by cutting off your 2 ends, the little slices fall as they should. Now I'm getting my pot's a little too hot here. Now I'll do that again so you'll see. And again, by cutting the onion in half so it'll lie flat, you can then do it quickly. I find I like a great big knife because the knife does a lot of the work. You don't have to press down on it. There, now we have 2 onions and 2 carrots and our herb bouquet, and then we're going to have some salt and pepper and wine. Now you can, if you want, use just vermouth, but we're going to be fancy, so I'm going to use either some Madeira or some port. And for this amount, about I should say, 1/3 of a cup of port. Then I'm also going to put in 1/3 of a cup of brandy, cognac. And be sure, if you're using wines, that you use a good quality, because if you don't, you can ruin what you're cooking, and it's much better if you don't want to spend the money, don't use it. And then we'll use a tablespoon of olive oil. You always need the olive oil because that carries the flavors, and then about a teaspoon of salt and a few good grinds of pepper. And then you let that marinate for 6 hours or overnight. Now we're going to have to use some blanched bacon with this, and I've always described it and we haven't done it before. And this is thick sliced fat bacon, and you drop it in a quart of simmering water and let it simmer for 10 minutes. And the reason for that is to get the bacony taste out, because if you have a smoky, salty taste, all your veal will taste like bacon, and it's supposed to taste like veal. Now with your marinade, again, you want to baste it about every once in a while to make sure that all of your liquid is going into the meat. And then we're going to, after you have let it marinate for 6 hours or overnight, you then take the meat out of the vegetables, and then you're going to saute the vegetables. So just scrape them all off. And then we want to drain out the marinade vegetables. And then they're going to be sauteed in the casserole in which we're going to cook the meat. So they just go in. Now, if you were not doing the marinade, if you didn't have time to do it, and you don't have to do it, you would use the same amount of vegetables. That would be 2 sliced carrots and 2 sliced onions, and you'd use the same wine and herbs and salt and pepper, and you just would simply saute your vegetables without the marinade at all, and then you would use your wine to cook the veal in. And now we're ready to stuff the veal. So you spread it out nicely, and we have a ham and cheese stuffing. As you can see, this is rather difficult to stuff, but you can manage it quite well. I have Swiss cheese here and boiled ham, and they're both sliced about 1/8 of an inch thick. And you just spread these in between the slices. It's sort of it's a sandwich with the cheese between the ham. There are quite a few Italian recipes in which they use ham and cheese with veal. And you'll find it gives a lovely flavor, and the cheese just sort of melts right into the veal. And then the ham gives a little added flavor, and then this lovely marinade gives even more. I guess, what did I say? Well, it's a ham between 2 slices of cheese, whatever it was. Anyway, you can see what it is I'm doing. There. You just have to tuck those things in wherever they'll go. And then we're going to tie it all up. Now, I think there'll be room for one more. This really looks like an impossible business right as it is now. Now I'm going to go get back to the bacon. Now after this has simmered for 10 minutes, you take it out and wash it out in cold running water and dry it, and then it's ready to use. I'm just going to take it out. I find chopsticks extremely useful in cases like this. Take that out. Now I have some that I've already washed. And now you have your problem of tying up the veal so that you can roast it. And these pieces of bacon here are to cover up the ham and cheese so that they won't come out while it's being cooked. And then you have some white string. And be sure that you use white string. If you use a dark string, it might flavor the veal or else color it, which would be terrible. I also have a great big bit of white string right in the kitchen. Make a double twist and then twist it around that way when you're going to tie. I don't think you'd ever get a butcher to do this for you, but it's I think it's rather fun to do. And you get much more familiar with the cuts of meat when you do some of your own boning, and then also once you've gotten onto it, then you can bone it just the way you like. You see, by the time it gets tied up, this is going to look much more presentable. But you can see why it would be easier to have that big, beautiful piece of veal that I showed you before. Now you've got your flap end over here, so you can just bring that up over. There isn't any real system for this. You'll just have to play it by ear. And it doesn't make any difference if a little bit of cheese, see there's a little bit of cheese sticking out there, you can just poke that back in. And then it'd probably be a good idea to have a piece of string around the other side of it to hold it lengthwise. Now that really is a very weird looking piece of meat. But as you'll see from the one that we have already cooked, that it turns out to look perfectly all right by the time it's roasted, because it sort of comes together. And then you want to be sure that you'll have it nice and dry, because we're going to brown the bottom of it. And if you don't have your meat dry, it won't brown. And now I want to show you another interesting thing, which this is called caul fat. Look at that, isn't that lovely? It looks like a veal. And what it is, it's the lining of a pig's stomach. And don't say ugh when you hear that, because it's a tasteless and odorless, very thin gossamer membrane which has little streaks of fat all through it. And they use it a lot in Europe. And this is a perfect thing for this kind of meat. And you can get your butcher to order this. Because you see, after you'd had it stuffed, then you'd put your meat on the caul fat and then wrap it all up in this lovely stuff. And then you tie it, and you see the whole thing would stay together and look very nice and neat. Caul is spelled C-A-U-L. And you can get your butcher to order this, because most people don't use it, and they just throw it along into the fat, into the lard cauldron, and nobody uses it except the Italians and the French and a few people like us now who know that it exists. And now when you have your meat all tied up and dried, and your vegetables have cooked for about 10 minutes so that they've browned a little bit, you then spread them to the side and put your meat in. And you let the bottom of it brown. Now in this case you can't turn the meat and brown it. If you had that caul fat, of course you could turn it and brown it on all sides. But in this case, because it's rather delicate because of this bacon and cheese on the top, you brown the bottom first, and that will take about 5 or 6 minutes. And you keep lifting it up a little bit with a spoon to see how the bottom was browning. And then when it was a nice even brown color in about 5 or 6 minutes, you would then put your casserole uncovered into a 450-degree oven, and you'd let the top brown. And about every 3 or 4 minutes, you take a ball baster, you know, these things that's just like a great big eyedropper, and you tilt your casserole and dig up some of the juices, and then baste the top of the meat with the juices. And then when the top of the meat was nice and brown, you would then pour in, you remember this wine marinade, you'd pour that in, and then you would put on aluminum foil on the top. And you want to put that in because in this method of covered roasting, which we're doing, you want the meat to steam in all these lovely vegetable and herb juices. And by having the aluminum cover on, that sort of makes it more close and steamy. And then you'd put the cover on your casserole and let it cook. And this piece of meat would take about an hour and a half. And it's done when you prick it deeply with a fork. And the juices that come out are just a pale yellow color. If there's any rosiness in the veal, you would then you'd let it cook for a few minutes longer. Veal is always served well done, but that doesn't mean that it's overdone. And then when the juices run pale yellow, your meat is done. And you will find that you will have about probably 2 cups of lovely winey meat juices in the bottom of your casserole. And you can use them as a sauce. You don't even have to thicken them if you don't want to. Or you can, as we have done so many times, you can thicken them with a little bit of cornstarch. Now I want you to see how this meat looks when it's all done. You see, there we have our braised meat, and you can see that lovely little brown from the melting cheese. And with it, we're serving whole baked tomatoes, and the meat is on a bed of braised spinach, and we have little sauteed potatoes all around it. And then the sauce has been boiled down and degreased and thickened very lightly with cornstarch. And this is an absolutely delicious way of serving the veal. And with it, you would have a red Bordeaux wine, which would go extremely well with it. And now you want to be sure also with this meat that you time it so that you get it done about 20 minutes ahead of serving, because you see, with all of these slits in the meat, if you carve it immediately, you've taken it out of the oven, you'll find that it separates. It does separate a little bit anyway, but if you've never been enthusiastic about veal because you felt the flavor was uninteresting, I think you'll change your mind when you try this because it's so good. That's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.